Henry VIII's reign, for all its political achievements and royal pageantry, revolved around one consuming obsession: succession. He was haunted by the question of heirs, the question of who would sit on the throne after him, and above all the question of whether he would leave behind a son. In Tudor England, daughters were valuable for dynastic marriages, but sons were everything. Sons meant stability, continuity, and the assurance that the fragile Tudor dynasty, only a generation old, would not collapse into another round of bloody civil wars like the Wars of the Roses. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first queen, had given him loyalty, dignity, and a deep bond with Spain, but she had not given him a living son. Their daughter Mary survived, but for Henry this was not enough. He convinced himself that God was punishing him, that his marriage to his brother's widow had cursed him with the absence of a male heir. Superstition mixed with desperation, and Henry began to believe that his dynasty was in danger of extinction unless he changed his course. It was in this climate that Anne Boleyn appeared, clever, witty, and very different from Catherine. Anne was no ordinary court beauty. She was ambitious, educated, and perfectly willing to use Henry's obsession to her advantage. While her sister Mary Boleyn had once been Henry's mistress, Anne was determined not to fall into the same role. She withheld her affections, resisted his advances, and dangled the promise of love in exchange for marriage. For Henry, it was intoxicating. For Anne, it was a gamble for the crown itself. Anne Boleyn was not just Henry's passion, she was his excuse. She became the symbol of what he believed he deserved, and what the Pope seemed to be denying him: the freedom to remake his marriage, to start anew, to secure the Tudor line with a son. Henry began pressing Rome for an annulment. His argument was that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid, because God's law forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow. The fact that the Pope had originally granted a dispensation to allow that marriage was, in Henry's eyes, irrelevant. He needed freedom, and he needed it quickly. The request landed on the desk of Pope Clement VII. Normally, Henry might have had a chance. He was, after all, the very monarch who had been given the title Defender of the Faith for writing against Martin Luther. But Clement was in a bind. Catherine of Aragon was not just Henry's queen, she was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who at that moment controlled much of Europe and had recently sacked Rome. Clement was effectively under Charles's thumb. Granting Henry an annulment would have been a direct insult to the most powerful man in Christendom. Politically, it was impossible. Spiritually, Clement could not risk appearing to bend divine law for a king's lust. And so, the answer was delay, obfuscate, and ultimately, refusal. Henry grew furious. Years dragged on, envoys traveled back and forth, legal arguments piled up, but the verdict remained the same: no annulment. Catherine refused to yield, insisting she was Henry's lawful wife and that her daughter Mary was legitimate. Anne grew impatient, pressing Henry harder, demanding action. The king, a man used to absolute obedience, found himself humiliated, trapped between a wife who would not step aside, a mistress who demanded the crown, and a pope who would not cooperate. It was here that Henry made his fateful pivot. The loyal son of Rome, the man who had once attacked Luther's heresies, began to see the pope as an enemy. If Clement would not give him what he wanted, then Henry would simply take it. With the help of advisors like Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell, he began reshaping England's laws. Step by step, Parliament passed measures limiting papal authority, redirecting church revenues to the crown, and preparing the ground for Henry's Declaration of Independence. In 1533, Henry married Anne Boleyn in secret. When Cranmer, now Archbishop of Canterbury, declared his marriage to Catherine null and void, Henry no longer cared what the Pope thought. He had crossed the Rubicon. By 1534, the Act of Supremacy proclaimed him Supreme Head of the Church of England. The Pope's authority in England was finished. This was not merely a divorce, it was a revolution. Overnight, England became a kingdom with its own national church, its monarch both king and spiritual overlord. Henry was not interested in Protestant theology. He still believed in Catholic doctrines, still attended Mass, still persecuted radical reformers. But he wanted control, not interference. The Pope had said no, and Henry's answer was to rip the entire country out of Rome's orbit. The consequences were staggering. Henry unleashed the dissolution of the monasteries, seizing lands, treasures, and wealth that had accumulated over centuries. Monks were driven out, abbeys stripped, libraries scattered, relics destroyed. To Henry, this was both practical and political. The crown was richer, and the nobility who benefited from the redistribution of land were now tied to his cause. But for ordinary people, it was disorienting. Monasteries had not only been centers of prayer, they had provided charity, schooling, and medical care. Their destruction left communities adrift. Rebellion soon followed. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 saw tens of thousands march in northern England, demanding the restoration of Catholic practices and papal authority. For a moment, it seemed Henry might lose control. He promised pardons, pretended to negotiate, but once the rebels dispersed, he had their leaders executed. Mercy was never his style. Abroad, the reaction was no less intense. Rome fumed, Catholic monarchs muttered, and Europe saw England as a rogue state. The Pope excommunicated Henry, formally cutting him off from the church he had once defended. Yet no crusade came. France and the Empire had their own rivalries, and no one could unite to bring England back into the fold. Henry stood alone, but secure. And here lies the absurdity that history loves. Henry VIII's great revolution was not born of theology, philosophy, or spiritual awakening. It was born of lust, ambition, and dynastic anxiety. He wanted a new wife. He wanted a son. He wanted his way. The Pope refused, and so Henry tore down centuries of tradition. If Martin Luther had cracked open the Catholic Church with his hammer and theses, Henry VIII smashed it with his royal ego. Luther offered doctrine, Henry offered hormones. Both changed the world. From a political standpoint, Henry's gamble paid off. He strengthened the crown, enriched his coffers, and secured obedience. From a religious standpoint, he opened Pandora's box. Once England was free from Rome, Protestant ideas flowed in, and the kingdom would never be the same. Henry tried to hold the line, persecuting reformers and clinging to Catholic practices, but he had already created a precedent. The king, not the Pope, decided England's faith. That precedent would survive him, shape his children's reigns, and define England's identity for centuries. In the end, Henry VIII did not just change his wife. He changed his world. He began as a loyal Catholic monarch and ended as the head of a national church. He began by begging the Pope for an annulment and ended by showing that monarchs could defy Rome altogether. He thought he was solving a personal problem, but he created a political and religious earthquake. His legacy is not merely the rhyme about 6 wives. It is the birth of a national church, the assertion of royal supremacy, and the permanent fracture of Western Christendom. Henry's reign is a reminder that history does not always move in straight lines of reason and principle. Sometimes it lurches forward because of pride, passion, and impatience. The Pope said no. Henry said yes. And in that clash, a new England was born. By the time Henry VIII had cemented his authority as head of the Church of England, the personal problem that had driven him to defy Rome still loomed over his life: succession. His gamble with Anne Boleyn had ended in tragedy. She gave him Elizabeth, another daughter, and then lost her head when Henry turned against her. In a macabre twist of fate, the very woman for whom he had torn England away from the Pope ended up condemned by the same king she H. Jane. The irony is, meanwhile, the consequences of Henry's break with Rome continued to unfold. The dissolution of the monasteries reshaped England's social and economic fabric. The crown grew wealthier, nobles were rewarded with land, and the power of the church was permanently broken. Yet resentment smoldered. Rebellions were crushed, but discontent simmered. Ordinary people still clung to Catholic traditions, processions, prayers for the dead, veneration of saints, even as Henry demanded obedience to his supremacy. The king's England was a strange hybrid, Catholic in doctrine, Protestant in loyalty, authoritarian in practice. Abroad, Henry's defiance left England isolated. Catholic monarchs regarded him as a pariah. The Pope excommunicated him, and though no united crusade was launched against him, the kingdom remained under suspicion. France and the Holy Roman Empire eyed England warily, and alliances shifted constantly. Henry sought to strengthen his position through marriage once more, agreeing to wed Anne of Cleves, a German princess whose brother was a Protestant duke. The marriage was meant to forge alliances on the continent. Instead, it became a farce. When Henry met Anne in person, he recoiled. She was not, in his view, as attractive as her portrait had promised. He mocked her as a Flanders mare and refused to consummate the marriage. Within months, the union was annulled. Anne was fortunate. Unlike Henry's other wives, she escaped with her head and a generous settlement, living comfortably in England for the rest of her life. But the incident was another reminder of the absurdity at the heart of Henry's reign. He had defied the Pope, broken with Rome, and torn apart monasteries for the right to control his own marriage. And here he was, fumbling through another annulment of his own making. Next came Catherine Howard, a young cousin of Anne Boleyn. She was vibrant, youthful, and briefly rekindled Henry's passion, but Catherine was also reckless. Rumors of infidelity spread, and evidence of affairs emerged. For Henry, now aging and increasingly insecure, this was intolerable. Catherine was executed in 1542, another queen who met the blade. Finally, Henry married Catherine Parr, his sixth and last wife. Catherine was intelligent, devout, and politically cautious. She acted more as a nurse and companion than a partner, caring for the king as his health deteriorated. Remarkably, she survived him, the only one of his wives to do so. By then, Henry was a shadow of his former self, his once handsome frame bloated, his legs ulcerated, his temper volcanic. Yet even in decline, he remained the man who had defied Rome, the king who had made himself supreme. And here lies the great irony. Henry's obsession with a male heir defined his life. He secured Edward, yes, but Edward would die at 15, leaving no children. The Tudor dynasty was ultimately secured by the very daughters Henry had once dismissed. Mary, Catherine of Aragon's child, became queen after Edward, dragging England back toward Catholicism in a bloody campaign that earned her the nickname Bloody Mary. Then Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, ascended the throne and presided over a golden age, establishing the Protestant Church of England firmly in place. The daughters Henry had feared would bring instability instead brought longevity to his dynasty. His obsession with sons blinded him to the power of the women he had already fathered. The long-term consequences of Henry's war with the Pope were vast. Politically, it strengthened the English crown, setting the stage for the powerful monarchy of Elizabeth. Economically, it redistributed wealth, empowering nobles and binding them to the Tudor state. Socially, it disrupted centuries of tradition, uprooting monasteries that had been woven into the daily life of communities. Religiously, it fractured the unity of Christendom, proving that papal authority could be challenged not only by reformers like Luther, but by kings themselves. For the Pope, Henry's defiance was catastrophic. Clement VII had refused the annulment to preserve papal authority, but the result was the opposite. By saying no to Henry, Rome lost an entire kingdom. England never returned to papal obedience. The act of supremacy remained, enshrining the monarch as head of the Church. Even after Henry's death, the precedent held. The Pope's shadow no longer reached across the Channel. And perhaps the most remarkable legacy of all is how personal folly created public transformation. Henry's motives were not noble. He did not seek to reform theology, as Luther had done. He did not dream of a purer faith, as Calvin preached. He wanted a divorce, a son, and freedom from interference. His ego, his lust, and his impatience drove him to actions that would outlast him by centuries. It is one of history's great ironies that a man so self-serving could reshape the destiny of a nation. There is a temptation to reduce Henry's story to gossip, to the rhyme about his 6 wives: divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. It is catchy, memorable, and true enough. But behind that rhyme lies a revolution. Behind the marital melodrama lies a kingdom transformed. The Pope's refusal to grant one annulment triggered a cascade of events that ended the unity of Western Christendom, shifted the balance of European politics, and gave rise to a national church that still exists today. In the final years of his life, Henry likely did not see himself as a reformer. He saw himself as a king who had bent the world to his will. He had wanted a son, and he had one. He had wanted freedom from Rome, and he had it. He had wanted power, and he wielded it. The fact that his decisions reshaped Europe was, to him, secondary. But history cares less about intentions than about outcomes. And the outcome of Henry's feud with the Pope was nothing less than the birth of a New England. Henry VIII's legacy is therefore twofold. On the one hand, he is remembered as a tyrant, a man of appetites, a king who discarded wives and friends alike when they no longer suited him. On the other, he is remembered as the monarch who asserted national sovereignty against foreign authority, who established a church independent of Rome, and who inadvertently laid the groundwork for modern English identity. He was selfish, reckless, and cruel. But he was also decisive, unyielding, and transformative. When we speak of Henry VIII today, we often laugh at his gluttony, his wives, his temper. But beneath the laughter is awe. Here was a man who broke the world order because he couldn't get a divorce. Here was a king whose hormones, pride, and desperation redrew the religious map of Europe. Here was the living paradox of history, a man petty in motive, but monumental in consequence. So yes, Henry VIII did not just change wives. He changed history. The Pope lost England forever, the monarchy gained unprecedented power, and the ripple effects spread across the continent. In trying to solve his own dynastic problem, Henry VIII left behind a legacy that shaped the fate of nations. His is a story that proves, in the most dramatic fashion, that sometimes the personal is profoundly, inescapably political. Henry VIII versus the Pope, the divorce that became a revolution. He didn't intend to inspire Protestant reformers, empower parliaments, or give birth to a new church. He just wanted a son. But history doesn't always give us what we want. Sometimes it gives us what we never imagined. And in the case of Henry VIII, it gave us a new religion, a new politics, and a reminder that one man's obsession can change the world forever.